darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still
given and after. I've never actually given an after dinner speech.
That's good.
Made
That's what we want.
And obviously then, over the floor, and as many of you as would like to speak, I hope we'll have the opportunity to hear from you on this. What has already, I think, been quite a moving occasion. When one's airlifted, dropped into the place where one had so many formative experiences. So what I thought I'd do is read a little poem and something of the, I know the heart sinks the moment here, but listen, something of the provenance of it will become clear, I hope, as we go along. But it's a poem called All On. All On. Are you with me?
Hand on.
Yeah. If you ask me, oh my children, whence this legend and tradition, whence this most astounding story of the class of 69ers, how they came to be so mighty, how they came to be so noble, I might point you to their schooling back there in St. Patrick's College that was run by the Vincentians, part Borstal, part Billy Bunter, part best education ever. You hear the rhythm, I hope, of Hiawatha? Oh, This is my first time at this.
That's very good.
First, I'll point you to a hillside, sometimes known as Sandy. Long before the Common Era, Navan Fort was but a twinkle in the eyes of our ancestors. Those ancestors built an alley, Taj Mahal of handball alleys, dominating Dorm and Drumlin for at least 2 millennia. When they built it, they kept coming to that hillside known as Sandy for one of their famous all-ons, or should the plural be alls-on? In that noble handball alley, forerunners of modern day boys, flashing bus passes to oarsmen, hauling them across the Callan, beautiful, the mighty Callan, in which it drowned Niall Niall, who was High King of Ireland, till he drowned there in the Callan, being held down by the day boys, being sat on by the day boys of the ink-stained duffels, fountain pens bleeding in duffels, day boys who were wont to smuggle tins of baked beans to the borders, tins of cold beans for the borders, on the hills still known as Sandy, eating spuds despite the wormholes, and spuds that were shot through with wormholes, eating shoes like Charlie Chaplin, Chaplin as in off the chapel, just as we were off the chapel, all deriving from La Chapelle, according to Monsieur O'Brien, eating eggs sent by their parents, eggs that were not Christian symbols, emblems rather of sheer hunger, eggs on which their names were written before they were boiled in cauldrons, names taken then by Father Spellman, boiled down by him to James Arthur's, James Arthur's and James Atchison, James Cafola of the Cafe. Soon the first spaghetti westerns would star that blow-in Clint Eastwood, not an Eastwood out of Cookstown, but Eastwood out of Rawhide. Clint who later loses marbles at Republican conventions. James Cafola and James Conlon, James Donaghy, James Duff, James Spear, making their way through corridors classrooms and laboratories, litmus tests named for litmosi, moss or lichens used for dyeing by Vikings who favoured dyeing both their tunics and their trousers. Litmus tests and Bunsen burners. Bunsen's named for Robert Bunsen, we call James to keep things simple. James Finnegan and James Fox Boy as he was known by Forky, died in the wool-trousered Forky of the Bray called Dobbins. James Gilmore and James Kennedy, whose famous namesake had stood firm against the Russians, firm against those lousy Russians and their lousy communism Rafferty had warned us against when he taught religious knowledge. Father Rafferty inveighing against Russian communism. Father Casey telling stories, that was religious knowledge, right? Father Casey telling stories as we lit the Bunsen burners, tales of Christy Ring the Hurler, Christie's memory still cherished up here in this northern province, where we vied with Baron Minnie, not the line of Minnehaha, the main squeeze of Hiawatha, nor one of the Minneconjou, but the Minnies out of Belgium, organist at the cathedral, in the game of organ grinding. Min who kicked us from his classroom, saying we were without talent, kicked us out upon the dunghill as a baron kicks a peasant. That was only me. Father Mullen making motions as he coached us in debating whether the Cold War was colder since the Cuban Missile Crisis, since 1963's freeze-up, saw the death of Cardinal Daunton, saw a little forced vacation, the last ever vacation from Hicks, O'Boyle and Doherty, for the noble James Kilpatrick, James McGurk, James McElroy, James McFlynn and James McKeever. James McKeever, James McKernan, taking our one last vacation before the O and A levels, more and more examinations. Marjoram and McAvinci, of the Cafe McAvinci's, noble Cafe McAvinci's, always piling on the questions in third form Latin, third form French. Who first called Cicero Tully? What became of the weird sisters? Where did Paul Verlaine shoot Rambo? When did Strongbow come to Ireland? Why is a coney called a coney? Once as a prize for third form French, that same Monsieur Bill O'Brien gave me a book by Percy French. His poems, prose and parodies. It's one of French's parodies, his parody of Hiawatha. Hiawatha by Longfellow, not that Eamon de Valera, but Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, from which I've drawn somewhat freely for this most astounding story of the class of 69ers. French's noble Hiawatha, buying clubs and starting golfing, said the game is too expensive. Said it first to James Finnegan at the 9th hole of Dungannon. Strange that it should come from Scotland. Then at last he tried lawn tennis, ended up playing the Comet Morris McLaughlin, rather than our James McLaughlin, though both are of Viking origin. Lochlanach, meaning a Viking. Viking sacked the Taj Mahal in 832 or thereabouts. Vikings vying with Vincentians. Vins vying then with Christian brothers for world title in lambasting. Lam as in the Old Norse Nemja, meaning to cripple by beating. Yet he managed to survive it, vying now for the world title in the order of cross-dressers for the annual production, Pinafore or Iolanthe, all produced by Father Casey, some featuring James McMahon, James McNally, James Bone, maybe James O'Brien, confusing those two James O'Briens, James O'Kane and James O'Reilly, James O'Riordan, whose own father tried to teach us mathematics, teach that algebraic cadabra to James Porteous and James Quigley, teach that algebraic cadabra wherein we saw two braziers, though we'd seen them in the Brantry, in Bratwurst and in Nebraska. water that is flat, Nebraska. Seen those female undergarments everywhere but on a female, though opening them on Maple Street. As we moved on through the 60s, all-ons turning into be-ins, be-ins turning into sit-ins for James Porteous and James Quigley. Always questions and more questions. Who's Lady Chatterley's lover? What's the story with the Viet Cong? Where did Bulldog get by his goal was? When was Jagger first called Jagger? Why did we say gerrymander? Jared Quinn going to sit-ins at the 9th hole in Dungannon, pointing out discrimination at the 9th hole in Dungannon. Then there was the Quinn from Cookstown. James Quinn had become a trustee, started his own supermarket. Now the tuck shop was plumb tuckered out at the Taj Mahal Alcatraz, running wine guns to the inmates. Wine guns, brandy balls and ciggies, woodbines and bents and hedges, up the hillside known as Sandy, where the Reverend Patrick Gunning, the irreverent John McCarter, introduced us to the mysteries. James Rafferty, James Reed, James Scally, mysteries of Francis Thompson, of Tom Gunn, and Tom Bedlam, Thomas Aquinas, Edison, Tom Paine, Tomas the Walderhead, mysteries profane and sacred, often questions with no answers, to James Reed, to James Scally, to James Walsh, and to James Waters. Sit-ins turning into riots, riots turning into sit-ins, sit-ins turning back to be-ins, be-ins turning back to all-ons, of course the pluralism calls on. All-ons like the one this evening, all-ons in the handball alley, metaphysical the alley, in which those of us still standing see ourselves at 12 or 13, even 18 or 19, even as we've all passed 60, waiting for the ball to find us, as it's found some of our classmates, taken some of them already. James Campbell, James Cassidy, taken James Fox, James McKeever, James Murray, taken too early, taken all of them too early. This is all, my gentle reader, that the poet has to tell you. Now I hear sweet voices calling, James Arthur's, James Atchison. Now the eggs have boiled 10 minutes, eggs on which our names were written as they were 50 years ago. Let us roll them down that hillside, down the hillside known as Sandy. Let us roll them with abandon. For I tell you, O my classmates, a reverence for irreverence is the single greatest lesson St. Patrick's College taught us, those of us who are still standing, waiting for the ball to find us, for this ultimate of all arms, waiting for the ball to find us.
Was, of course, very keenly contested. You know, the motion was taken very, very seriously. I recall some wounding asides from Danny that if I'd spent less time in the study hall and more in the debating society, the motion would have been carried more favourably. However, I was reminded that we had one David Atchison here who stood up for 20 minutes and most eloquently advanced the notion and then refuted it, sat down, said absolutely nothing, and we still managed to fail. I thought we'd won the motion. There it was.
Ask the secretary.
Indeed, you recorded it in the college magazine, so it's all on the DVD, folks. But of course, one of my fondest recollections was one Martin Quinn. I think he's with us, isn't he? Yes, he's over there, of course. Martin was my bridge partner. And he was a very aggressive player, so you had to be, as it were, underplay your hand, as it were. But I recall that even then he had a liking for the nicotine. And so Martin would basically pull on the cigarette, look upwards, we'd all look upwards and we would see this cigarette smoke going up, spiraling up, and of course the other pairs, our opponents, were watching it as well, totally mesmerized. But of course he was like the fox and the rabbit, and so basically he then looked down and he played the cards, and there they were, 4 or 5 tricks that he won today. So that was a very nice experience. Other experiences, I think, were with my Brian, a very enthusiastic chemistry partner, and I think I did mention this to 1 or 2 others, but this, I remember on one occasion that this was my first experience firsthand of an episode of self-immolation, which was to say, if you have a test tube full of alcohol and you suddenly remove the water bath under it and directly apply a Bunsen burner, it expands rather rapidly. Not only that, but there's air around, and if the said Brian then pulls the retort, it all went over him, and so he was sort of a massive flame from head to foot. But thankfully, low temperature burning and all that, he survived. There were a lot of other things, I think, to say. I think more seriously, I would say that, and this is probably true of many of us, that the first 3 years were very much one of survival. And I always attach myself to the bigger guys like Harry here, basically for protection. And then the latter years, you looked outwards at your classmates who were day boys, who were the window in the world, and so forth. So that was the world of beer and girls, and and how we would go on and so forth. So I think more fondly of the latter years that I was at the college, and I think the very fact that we managed to survive the first few years probably meant that we could survive anything that was thrown at us in life, and I'm sure we've all had our ups and downs. Anyway, I hadn't planned to say anything whatsoever, but you can tell that that having knocked around a few universities and with no one speaking well, I thought I'd stand on my feet and see what came out. So there we go. This is the interlude for somebody to properly collect their thoughts and follow the wonderful poem that Paul gave us, which got better and better towards the end. So it's actually been great to see you all and to see that you're all, as it were, still alive and doing so well. The other thing is, you're wondering when he's going to sit down, but is that I was actually slightly apprehensive about coming, because the trouble is that, particularly if you were a boarder, and there's Danny looking at me very, very carefully, you basically know each other very well, and you know the weakness and so forth. But, we tolerated each other, and got on pretty well. And I have to say that all the negative things were nothing to do with you guys, but it was largely the bigger boys, as I was saying to Brian, basically. He managed to win most of his fights, I lost most of mine. Anyway, I'm going to sit down, shut up, and let somebody else do the talking.
The only reason I became the man in charge of nicotine, cigarettes, wine, and all these other illegal drugs was Liam McNally from Margaret House the year before me. And I thought, that's a good way of getting out of school. So I asked Father Liam, could I have Liam McNally's job? He didn't think about it and he said yes. I thought that was excellent. Until you all decided to go out anyway, and he called you all into the oratory and said, nobody's allowed to go down the town except Martin Quinn. Thank you very much.
Years of pent-up frustration, and we took his liberal regime with every, and we went mad. But as I told some of the guys earlier on here, he lectures on church history, but chose on one occasion to lecture us on wines. told us that one day we'd face stuff called Matthew's Rosie. To avoid, so hopefully nobody's at Matthew's Rosie here tonight, although I believe it's made a comeback. But unfortunately, as I say, I took that year to heart. And I had to go back to the beach several years later, but find the course again. But it was a breath of fresh air after the brass.
Yes.
Not only was I afraid of the brass, but my father, who would come to interview the brass, was also afraid of the brass because he'd been taught by him. So we were always on a loser. Anyway, those are my few thoughts. Anything else? You look
I enjoyed it very much.
Started with 20 to 8, am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
I thought it was 20 to 8.
The
The story depends on the fact.
Go for it.
So we were always entitled to go and see the first 10 minutes of Top of the Pops on a Thursday evening, remember? Right? And of course the highlight of Top of the Pops was Pan's people. Everything else, very unimportant, but Pan's people, if they appeared in the first 10 minutes, it made our evening. So people got into this, was it the smoking room, whatever room it was, and they vied for the top seats near the television, the black and white television, so they could see Pan's people. And one night, as usual, everyone raced into the room, got into the front seats. I wasn't there early, I was near the back, and the Top of the Pops came on. And sure enough, in the first 10 minutes, if you didn't, Top of the Pops lasted for 30 minutes, so it depended on the first 10 minutes. That was the critical period for us. And in that first 10 minutes, sure enough, Pan's people appeared. But so did Dunning at the back. He appeared from the back of the room. And those of us sitting in the back of the room could see Dunning appear, but not the boys at the front. So we were looking around, and we knew the normal shouts and cahooing that would go on when Pan's people appeared. And of course, the room went silent. Dunning stood there, and someone, I don't know which one of you it was, shouted out, Pan's people here. But they appeared on the screen, but instead of wearing the bikinis that they normally wore that night, they wore long dresses. In the crowd, someone shouted, no good tonight, boys. Get up your clothes on. Not wanting to be associated with such remarks.
A very good one, I hope.
But the other recollection I have is that it always came as a source of great pleasure that when we got a dentist, I noticed telling us that we had to go to the dentist, because that enabled us to go to the dentist and have whatever chiseling the dentist would do, and then nip around, of course, to Macavinci's afterwards.
Absolutely, Russell Street. That is to get to Russell Street.
Yeah. And there was always about 5 minutes, wasn't there?
Yes.
And so the problem, of course, was that you went to the dentist first of all, and you were totally inoculated. Your mouth was frozen. So when you went for the feed in Macavinci, you didn't taste it. All you could feel was the food hitting the bottom of the stomach. And you were so happy. That's my true recollection.
And I went, no. And he went, yes! And he broke his ass laughing. And no, the next day I came in, the next day it wasn't. No, it wasn't. Jeremy was a first year, so they would have been way over So the next day I come in and I'm going, Jesus Christ, this is serious altogether. So I reckon the next day, sort of walking her down the veranda, comes up on the top of me and goes, "Hey, sing!" Yeah. And I said, "Yeah." And the broke their ass laughing at me. I spent 7 years in that shaggy place thinking I had a speech impediment. John, man.
Tous les garçons et les filles de mon âge se promènent dans la rue de par deux. Tous les garçons et les filles de mon âge savent bien ce que c'est qu'être heureux. Et les yeux dans les yeux, et la main dans la main, ils s'en vont amoureux, sans peur du lendemain. Oui, mais moi, je vais seul par les rues, l'âme en peine. Oui, mais moi, je vais seul, car personne ne m'aime. Mes jours comme mes nuits sont en tout point pareils, sans joie et plein d'ennui. Personne ne murmure je t'aime à mon oreille. Tous les garçons et les filles de mon âge font ensemble des projets d'avenir. Tous les garçons et les filles de mon âge savent très bien ce qu'aimer veut dire. Et les yeux dans les yeux, et la main dans la main, ils s'en vont amoureux, sans peur du lendemain. Oui, mais moi, je vais seul par les rues, l'âme en peine. Oui, mais moi, je vais seul, car personne ne m'aime. Mes jours comme mes nuits sont en tout point pareils, sans joie et plein d'ennui. Au camp d'ombre pour moi brillera le soleil. Comme les garçons et les filles de mon âge, connaîtrai-je bientôt ce qu'est l'amour. Comme les garçons et les filles de mon âge, je me demande quand viendra le jour où les yeux dans ses yeux, et la main dans sa main, j'aurai le cœur heureux, sans peur du lendemain. Le jour où je n'aurai plus du tout l'âme en peine. Le jour où moi aussi j'aurai quelqu'un qui m'aime.